Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well and staying safe and sane in this craziness still. This is a video I'm recording for my Introduction to Creative Writing class for the poetry unit, and also to welcome my dear friends AP English class to view this video as well. I hope it is beneficial and at least tolerable for most everyone in the who views it. If you'll indulge me, this is a bit of an odd video because I would never normally um, teach one of my own poems, but as this poem is just in the draft phase, this is the sort of the first serious draft of this poem, and because it's about sort of what I'm going through and in my little corner of this whole business, I thought it might be um, applicable here and helpful to those of us as we sit down to write our own poems to sort of work through the process. So I want to talk about process first, and then the tone of the poem, and then do some analytical stuff talking about word choices, punctuation, um, line breaks, and so forth. And maybe through that process, even if the poem is not great, which I certainly don't think it is, we can learn from it. As far as process goes, the first thing I'd like to say is that I talk with my students all the time, and this will be review for many of you, or repetitive for many of you. I talk with many my students all the time about being open to the possibility of meaning in the things that come from within us, as well as the things that come from outside of us. That our ideas only come from within or without, and we're sort of the membrane in between. And so the idea for this poem came from just walking around the neighborhood with my family, my wife and daughter, and our dog. And so what came first was this phrase that became the opening line of the poem, "The world has stopped." And in addition, just the idea of bird song, because in my experience here, and I guess this depends on where you live and who you are, in my experience here, um, the birds are significantly louder now when there's not all this other noise going on, and the world has stopped. Is not anything, you that's like a real breakthrough or something. But we're both home from work, and our daughter's home from school, and so is everyone else, and there's not any traffic, and it's a very strange sort of time and place to be alive. So those are the first two things that came to my mind. And so what I did, and this is super important, is I wrote them down immediately. I got on my phone and I emailed them to myself, just those two phrases: "The world has stopped," and then "birdsong," so I could come back to them later on. And I went through several written versions. So what I do is I get my yellow paper, and I write and I rewrite and rewrite and rewrite until I feel like it's ready to go to the computer. If you don't do it that way, everyone has their own thing. But for me, that works well because I feel like I can't just sit down at the computer and write because there's too many other things. I can open up a new window and go to Twitter. My email is binging, etc. And something about the flashing cursor is cruel to me. So I handwrite everything before I finally make it to the computer. And then once I get to typing, I can adjust things a little bit more easily with copying and pasting and deleting and hitting return and so forth. So that's kind of the process of how I got this to where it currently is over the last week or so. The tone of the poem, maybe I'll read it one time through and then go back and talk about the tone and see if it makes any sense to you. So this poem is now called 6 Feet, is the working title. The world has stopped, and so we walk the quiet neighborhood over and over. For some, for far too many, it has ended alone, convulsing behind closed doors. A horror of the horror, the gulf between their panic and the crystalline bird song we discuss as we stroll, my daughter skipping rope along the way. Crickets chirr, the dog tugs its leash, A breeze dusts the pollen. There is hope for rain. And so it's just a little poem. And it's a little poem about a big worldwide pandemic. Um, I think, generally speaking, my advice to writers is to write about small things, and those small things can become important and can become representative of larger things. So the tone of this poem is small. The tone of this poem, I hope, is quiet, um, for a number of reasons. One is I'm not going through the worst of this. All over the world, people are really struggling terribly, and I pray that none of you are going through the worst of it either. My poem can't co-opt their pain, right? Um, or at least it would be incredibly difficult for me to, it would feel like I was co-opting their pain. It would be incredibly difficult for me to convey that pain, that suffering, when it's not something that I myself am going through. And so I can't truly understand the horror of the whole thing. I only know my own personal experience of it. And so it makes sense for me to write about it that way. My own personal experience of it is primarily fear. Um, that's why I have not slept well in a month, is sort of the middle of the night uh, fear about how bad this is and how bad it's going to get, and I hope it doesn't make it, to my family and so forth. Uh, there's also a tremendous frustration with what we are doing or not doing as a community, as a country, to sort of combat this thing. Um, a frustration of everyday existence where I've got to teach from home now, which I do not like, staring into this computer screen and teaching. I'd much rather be in my classroom. I'm sure some of you go through those frustrations as well. The frustration of just being home and of being bored, and my daughter being home from school and having to do distance learning and figuring out a way to fill all the hours and wandering the block over and over and over again, keeping our space. But then there's also this odd calm that's going on in my world where, as I mentioned before, it's just quiet out. And there's something, I've had some conversations with friends where it's like, if this wasn't such a horrible thing, there's actually like a real beauty to it that, you know, um, we can all just sort of, we're forced to stop like the merry-go-round of our lives and um, just sort of sit and be, and it's meditative in a lot of ways. So there's these like two sides of it, right? There's like fear, and then there's peace, and then somewhere in the middle there's this frustration of our living through it. And so that leads to the tone of the poem that I'm trying to get across. Um, it's like a willful calm almost, to in some ways to calm myself down as well. And some of the ways that I try to convey that tone in the poem is, one, the length of the poem being very short, um, the length of the lines being so short. Sometimes if you're writing a quiet poem, the lines should be short, and if you're writing a loud poem or it's about some craziness or excitement or chaos, the lines can be of wild, long, and various lengths and so forth. Or if you're writing a very expansive poem, obviously like Whitman or Ginsberg's Howl or something like that, you've got those incredibly long lines that are trying to sort of, as I say, swallow the universe and get it out in one poem. And this is not that, of course. It's not even trying to. So the length of the lines, the length of the poem, the use of punctuation in this poem. Punctuation is something I talk with my students about all the time. It's a wonderful tool. But so as the writer, I control how quickly you read what I write. I make you pause at the end of each line, whether there's an end stop, a mark of punctuation there, or whether there isn't. You have to stop at the end of a line, even if it's just briefly, right? It's like an eye stop almost. You just sort of pause with your eyes and go back to the beginning of the line. But also to include so many commas dashes and periods, those short sentences at the end of the poem. It's intended to make you sort of stop and quietly stroll through the poem, like we're quietly strolling through our neighborhood. And so that's kind of where the tone comes from it. Uh, it's not the world is ending, because it doesn't necessarily feel that way all the time to me. It's not everything is going to be okay, although the poem ends with a note of hope. Uh, but it's not and everything's going to be okay, everybody calm down poem, because I don't feel that way either. And so the tone is really trying to, or what I'm trying to do with the tone of the poem is to represent the strange place that I am right now. And so I wanted to talk a bit about some of the word choices. Um, if you've taken any of my classes before, you know that we teach poetry last because I think it's the best of the genres of creative writing. I also think it's the most difficult, and the one that requires the most discerning eye. Because if you're writing a 300-page novel and you have some bad, some not wonderful writing, or you got a bit of a plot issue, or you pick the wrong adjective, no one's going to pay much attention. But if you've got a 20-line poem, or what is this, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15-line poem, and those lines are small, and you've got some words that don't work well, or poorly handled punctuation, it can ruin the whole poem. So it gets very narrow when you get to poetry. And so I want to just sort of point out, not that any of this, again, I hate to belabor this, but I'm not trying to say that I do a great job with any of this, just that this is some of the stuff that you need to be thinking about when you're being a critical reader of poetry and when you're trying to write poetry. So the first thing, the title of the poem, the working title now, which I just put on it yesterday, is 6 Feet. And I am working with that title because it's like a double entendre here, where it has sort of two meanings, where 6 feet obviously is the separation we're all supposed to keep from one another when we're doing our safe distancing. And so I've been hearing that a lot: stay 6 feet apart, stay 6 feet apart. But 6 feet is also the traditional depth of burial, so planting someone 6 feet deep. And so there's that double entendre of, it's how far we're supposed to stay away from each other to stay safe. It's also how deep in the ground we go, if, God forbid, we get sick and don't recover. So that's the title I've been working with. Just moving through the poem, and I won't take too much time on this, but if you look at this line right here, the first line of the second stanza, I battled between it being for some, comma, far too many, comma, end of the line, and the way it is now, which is for some, comma, for far too many. And I stuck the other 4 in there because it gives us the 3 F sounds, which I kind of like that alliteration. Just personally, I don't like alliteration that goes beyond 3 in a line, because it's a little much. So this is kind of pushing it for me, but I wanted to sort of overstuff the line the way that Keats does in his poem To Autumn, when he's talking about the vines of fruit being overstuffed. He adds extra, in that line of the poem, he adds, I think, 2 extra stressed beats. And so I wanted to try something like that. So the extra 4 is like, it's too many, if that makes some sense. So it's just something I was thinking about. And then this one, A Horror of the Horror. I initially, it was The Horror of the Horror, because what I'm talking about is the distance between what is really going on sort of behind, the hospital doors and the apartment doors, and some pretty awful situations. That actual horror and what I'm going through. And so the gulf between the two is a horror of the horror that other people are going through these awful things, and I'm currently not. I feel like I need to keep knocking on wood for this. But I didn't want to call it the horror because there's so many other horrors of people's experience of it. So I changed it to a horror of the horror. And this line is also an allusion to or a reference to David Foster Wallace's The View from Mrs. Thompson's House, which is about his experience of September 11th from a neighbor's living room in Indiana. And so it's kind of the same, it's the same sort of thing where he was experiencing this tremendous horror of 9/11 from this sort of safe, anodyne experience with these mainly older women in Indiana in the living room, and what it feels like when there's this terrible stuff going on, and I'm sitting in my office in my house with my family, and the sun is shining, and things are just quiet. So there's like I don't know, it's a guilt or something like that there. I wanted to use the word stroll specifically because initially it was walk, but stroll conveys like a nonchalance or an ease with which we're walking, which, like I feel like in my normal life before everything stopped, it was just like hustle, 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 hustle. And I wasn't strolling anywhere. You know what I mean? It was like always every walk was like to get to something. Walking the dog was to get done walking the dog so I could, shower and eat and get dressed and go to work and etc. But now we're just sort of slowly strolling the neighborhood. And so, other words like that, this is where a thesaurus is good, amble, saunter, those types of words. But amble and saunter feel like out of syntax. They feel like something the cowboys did or something, So stroll it's got that nice S sound. It seems to convey what I'm looking for. The crickets chirr here. I love that word chirr for some reason. As opposed to the crickets singing or the crickets, whatever it is they do, crickets chirring. I like to turn that into to the verb, and have those two C's right next to each other, crickets chirr, and just that 2-word sentence. I liked that. And then, I don't know, certainly for my students in Georgia, I don't know what it's like up in the Northeast right now, but the pollen has been brutal, which is a whole nother thing. But everything is yellow with that dusty, chalky pollen yellow. And when the breeze hits the road, the pollen sort of like floats off like dust. And so I wanted to take that word dust and turn it into the verb as well, to repurpose dust as a verb. So the breeze dusts the pollen, like, when you're sweeping the floor or you're dusting the counter or something like that, and it just sort of goes up into the air like a cloud. So those are just some examples of specific words that I've been thinking about. And again, not saying they're great or super effective, but I am saying that you should be thinking about them like that when you sit down to read poetry or to certainly to write your own poems. Line breaks are like super important to me. So if you're not writing formal poetry, right, you need to make your own completely up to you decisions on when to break each line where. So if you're writing a formal poem that might be iambic pentameter, you have to break your line. You have to somehow get your line to 10 syllables and break the line there. If you're writing a rhymed poem, you have to have a rhyme at the end of the line, and that sort of determines where your line breaks. But if you're writing free verse, as we're doing here, you pick your own. So I just want to point out, and so you should always have a reason why you break your line where you break your line. I tend to believe that each line should have its own weight to it, its own completion to it. Everyone, different people have different philosophies on it, but that's part of mine. So I just want to point out a couple of these, and this is one of the things that's great about when you finally do move to a computer, because when you write things out, I don't know about your handwriting, but mine isn't super accurate when it comes to how long my lines are going to be. So when I finally type them, I can see how close I got. I like my lines to be pretty close in length, unless I have a specific reason not to. Um, so here's just a few that I wanted to talk about, and maybe you can sort of see what I'm trying to do anyway. The second line of the poem. So the world has stopped, and so we walk the quiet line break neighborhood over and over. So we're walking the quiet neighborhood, but by ending the line at quiet, it's like we're walking the quietness, right? We're walking the quietness that is the world that we live in. Just by having the line break there, it stands on its own. So we walk the quiet has, to me, I think, a relatively effective way. To end that first stanza, I ended it with over and over and end the stanza there, because having that extra space here after over and over emphasizes the over and over, because we are doing this walk, 5 times a day or something like that. And so the repetition of it is all the more apparent by including not only a line break, but a stanza break at that point. Here's one that I really struggled with. And so if you have strong opinions about this, contact me and let me know what you think. So initially, I had it like this. Because I like ending lines sometimes with a gerund form of a verb after a comma for whatever reason, it's just something that I enjoy. I had it this way. For some, for far too many, it has ended alone, convulsing behind closed doors. So it has ended alone, convulsing. That, to me, sort of had more of an emphasis on the suffering of many in the situation. But then I had this short line, behind closed doors, that I didn't like all sitting by itself there. And if I switched it back to the way I have it now, I have this last line of the stanza, convulsing behind closed doors, which makes sense on its own. And then I've got this line, which it has ended alone, and then alone being a short line on its own, emphasizing the isolation of people distancing from one another, the isolation of people in these ICUs and emergency rooms on respirators and things like that. And so if I was going to have one line by itself, I think I'd rather have it be this one. But again, if you've got a good argument for why it should go the other way, shoot me an email and let me know. And then 2 final points, and I'll get out of your way. I wanted to end it with these 4 short sentences, because it really, or what I'm trying to do is really sort of emphasize to go back, the tone, the quietness, the odd, anxious serenity of the whole thing, the pensive nature of it. And so those 4 sentences sort of force you to stop every time. They are isolated from one another by the grammatical structure of an individual sentence, by them being on their own separate lines, and by them being sort of different, right? We have the crickets, we have the dog, we have the breeze, and then this last line of it being, there is hope for rain. I didn't want it to be something, I feel like it would be super corny if all of a sudden it started raining and washing away the pollen, right? Because that would be like a very Hollywoody happy ending, like here's the cleansing rain or something. But there is a hope, right? And so it's just a hope for rain kind of hints towards a possibility of something cleansing, which the rain always is, right? And if you think of anytime anyone talks about rain anymore, since basically in the last 120 years, it feels like we have to talk about, Eliot's The Wasteland, but that's not an overt reference here, but it's always there, that idea of, the rain coming and offering life again to the deserted world, the deserted wasteland. But in any event, so there just being hope for that. So I wanted to end on like a hint, like a head nod, a pump fake towards happiness. Um, and so, that's where I am. It's just a tiny little poem. It's not the greatest thing in the world. Uh, but I hope that in sort of going through it as I have tried to do here, you can take something from it, whether it be on something about what to look for when you're reading a poem, something about the possibilities of writing your own poetry, about process, about sort of trying to control the tone of the poem that you want. Um, and yeah, that's it. So thanks for listening, and stay safe out there and take care of yourselves.